In our last episode, we dove deep into the amazing depth of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and how it's been marginalized over the years. But today, we're flipping that script. This episode is all about hope. Real-world examples of Indigenous communities leading the way in conservation. From the rainy forests of British Columbia to the arid American Southwest, Indigenous practices aren't just sustaining the environment. They're regenerating it in ways modern science is only just coming to understand. Welcome to Voices of the Land, a podcast that navigates the intersection of Indigenous rights and conservation biology. I'm your host, Ruhi, and in today's episode, we will be taking you to meet the guardians of the land. Our first story is about the Pacific Northwest of Canada, where researchers made an astonishing discovery: forest gardens. These were not gardens in the actual sense, not rows of vegetables, but rather patches of land within dense forest, intricately cultivated by Indigenous communities hundreds of years ago.
I think we have some huckleberries here somewhere, maybe even salmon berries. There's strawberries. My name is Leona Brown. I am Gitsan and Nishka. Today is an opening of this park at Oxford as a planter day and getting the community together. It's an Indigenous food forest. It's just a space to showcase all the Indigenous plants that are Indigenous or cultural to the West Coast as much as possible, but giving urban Indigenous people the opportunity to see what those plants are, how do they look, and which ones that we can eat and which ones are for medicine. I brought some tobaccos, plants that will be planted here. What I typically use is I dry them out and I pray to the other plants that I'm harvesting, and I put it down and pray that the plants and medicines that I'm harvesting go to the people that need it.
All right.
Here's what makes forest gardens special. Even after being abandoned for over a century, they still have more biodiversity than the surrounding quote-unquote natural forests. They're home to plants that provide food, medicine, and habitat for animals. Plants that don't naturally grow there, but were carefully brought in and cultivated by Indigenous people. These gardens are a perfect example of how humans can enhance ecosystems. They are more biodiverse, more resilient, and more productive than the unmanaged forests surrounding them. Take, for example, hazelnut trees. Native to dry regions, Indigenous communities brought them to coastal British Columbia and planted them in their gardens. These trees, along with cranberries, elderberries, and wild ginger, created ecosystems that fed both people and wildlife. It is not only about the past. These forest gardens offer us examples of how to manage land to benefit both people and nature, something we urgently need in the present. Our next stop is Northern California, where the Yurok and Karuk tribes have been using fire as a tool for thousands of years. While most of us think of fire as destructive, these tribes know that fire can be a force for good, if it's done the right way. Controlled burns remove dead plants and underbrush that fuel dangerous wildfires. They also promote the growth of native plants, improve soil health, and create animal habitats. The Yurok and Karuk have always known that, but their practices were suppressed for more than a century due to government fire suppression policy.
I was raised in the ancestral village of Woonkaruk on the lower Salmon River. My great-grandma taught me how to use fire starting when I was 4 years old, and paying attention to the animals and the plants and everything in nature to be, so they can serve as our guide.
Distinct to the Karuk tribe is cultural burning.
The cultural burn, it's a little bit different. It's like you're not parsing the landscape out into these distinct little units. You're picking times of year when the conditions are just right to where this component of the ecosystem will burn, whereas this one right next to it won't.
Tripp says their system of diverse trees and plants not only helped feed the people through acorns, native crops, and medicinal plants, but created a diverse forest with different burning properties.
But if you've got pine trees mixed with black oak and white oak and madrone, yeah, you can burn that after 4 days of sun in February.
Cultural burning wasn't just a form of ceremonial practice, but a way to keep their grasses, shrubs, and forest floors from becoming big fuel for lightning outbreaks.
The fires are small and controlled, but they make a big difference. After a burn, you'll see more wildflowers, more berries, and healthier trees. The land remembers what it needs. Now, after decades of devastating wildfires, scientists and policymakers are finally recognizing the value of cultural burns. In some areas, they're partnering with Indigenous fire managers to bring these practices back.
Controlled burning is, first of all, a natural process that has been going on for thousands of years. So when you look at ecosystems like longleaf pine and other southeastern forests, they're adapted to that fire. And so they need that to thin out competing vegetation, to keep the open structure, promote forage for things like turkey and deer and other wildlife. So by burning these low-intensity fires every several years, you reduce that fuel, you kill some of the competing vegetation, and you rejuvenate that understory, that grassy herbaceous understory that the wildlife need.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the best solutions to modern problems come from ancient wisdom. Finally, let's visit Wisconsin, where the Menominee Nation has been practicing sustainable forestry for over 150 years. Their forest is so dense and healthy, it stands out on satellite images, an island of green surrounded by less managed lands. The Menominee's approach is simple but revolutionary. They only cut down as many trees as the forest can regrow. They also maintain biodiversity, long-term monitoring, and single tree selection, meaning they can take individual trees instead of clear-cutting large areas.
For a century, MTE has provided a paycheck for Menominee mill workers, a way of life for Menominee lumbermen, and an economic base for the Menominee community. But what may be most remarkable about Menominee Tribal Enterprises' 100 years is that the mill remains surrounded by trees. The entire reservation is one of the most densely forested parts of Wisconsin. There are more trees today than before the mill was built.
At that time, we had 1.3 billion feet of timber on a reservation. We now have over 1.7 billion feet.
Many companies credit a founder or CEO for their success. At MTE, it's Chief Oshkosh, who in the 19th century advised cutting selectively and sustainably, moving slowly from east to west.
When you reach the end of the reservation, turn and cut from the setting sun to the rising sun, and the trees will last forever.
And they have lasted. When the other great forests of northern Wisconsin were stripped bare, this forest remained. But not because it had been left alone.
When at first glance it looks like a forest that hasn't been managed. It's anything but that. It's a managed forest.
This philosophy has paid off. The Menominee Forest is not only economically productive, it provides timber for their community, but it's also one of the healthiest and most biodiverse forests in the region. These are just a few examples of Indigenous communities using traditional ecological knowledge to care for the land. Forest gardens, controlled burns, and sustainable forestry. All of these show us that living in harmony with nature isn't just possible, it's essential. We continue in the next podcast by examining some of the ways in which Indigenous struggles over land rights can often rub against the more contemporary versions of conservation. For the meantime, just reflect. What should we learn from these stories? And how are these leaders already showing the rest of us?